Hey, sixth graders, welcome back to history. We are continuing in our study of ancient Egypt, which I really love this. This is one of my favorite things to study, and I always enjoy teaching it. I think that it's really interesting. The Egyptian culture is so fascinating to me because it lasted such a long time period. Today, we are going to be talking about the New Kingdom. We are going to cover pages 71 through 74 in your textbook, and we are going to use page 39 in your SAM to take notes. So let's get started. The New Kingdom lasted from 1570 to 1075 BC, so about 500 years. The Middle Kingdom, which we talked about last time, was very peaceful, but that peace did not last. And one of the reasons it didn't last is because the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom neglected the security of their borders, and they did not keep their forts in good repair. They did not keep their forts stocked and ready. And because of this, there was a group of people called the Hyksos. I'm going to write this on the board. So anything I write on the board is going to be something that you'll be putting on this page in your SAM as notes. Okay, so the Hyksos. The Hyksos were, is just a word that means foreign rulers, and historians actually have no idea where they came from. They're not really sure. One of the things, though, that historians believe is the case is that the Hyksos were a very brutal group of people, and they were very violent, and they attacked and just sort of took whatever they wanted. The Hyksos ruled Egypt for about 150 years. Now, you can kind of think of the Hyksos as a double-edged sword, right? So in one way, this was really bad, that they came in and they took over, and they were really harsh and brutal in the way they took over. But in the end, the Egyptians learned some things from the Hyksos. For one thing, the Hyksos taught the Egyptians how to make and use weapons made out of bronze and out of iron. Very important, because when you're talking about weapons, you want weapons that are sturdy and will last, and these materials were very advanced for that time period. Another thing that the Egyptians learned from the Hyksos was about horse-drawn chariots that had two wheels. Horse-drawn chariots with two wheels. So these were the kind that you've probably seen pictures of that had like the place for someone to stand and then one wheel on either side and the horse, one or two horses in front. So the Egyptians learned a lot from the Hyksos as far as things that they would use and be known for later on as they were going out and doing the conquering of other peoples. There was an Egyptian prince whose name was Ahmose, and he eventually was able to drive out the Hyksos and get them out. And he created what you might call a protective area, a buffer, south of the Upper Kingdom. So remember that the Upper Kingdom was actually down here, if you look at a map, right? Remember that? And so he created a buffer area down below to keep people out. He expanded the Egyptian kingdom further east, and Ahmose's rule is what sets the stage for what historians call the New Kingdom. You would consider that the New Kingdom is what most historians agree to be kind of the greatest time period in Egyptian history. Ahmose made Egypt more powerful and stronger than it had ever been, and it became a regional power. It became a power within that area around the Mediterranean and in the Middle East. The New Kingdom pharaohs were warrior kings, and they continued to expand Egypt's borders through conquest. They conquered the neighboring people. Now, they also gained some wealth through trade, but the main way they expanded their borders was through conquest and war. They did trade with other people in order to get gold and to get ivory and other things that they wanted. And that leads me into talking about a very interesting person in Egyptian history. I have always thought that this person was really fascinating to study about. And I recommend, now don't do this on your school time, do it on your own time, but I highly recommend that you maybe do a little research on this person because I think she's amazing. And yes, I said she. It's very unusual in this time period to have a queen, but that's exactly what happened. Queen Hatshepsut. That's how you pronounce it, or that's the best I can do. But Queen Hatshepsut was one of the earliest rulers in the New Kingdom. There was quite a lot of intrigue and kind of politicking happening behind the scenes with her as the ruler. She ruled with her husband until he died. She was his queen. And then she ruled with her nephew. Now, her nephew was supposed to be the next king, but he was too little to rule. So she ruled in his stead as a regent. She was what we would call the first woman to be pharaoh. She was the first woman to be pharaoh. There were a couple. Sometimes we refer to them as queens. Sometimes we refer to them as pharaohs. There were a few. Our book doesn't tell us a lot about her, but I really recommend that you do a little bit of research. Again, don't do this on your school time. Do this on your own time. Make sure all your other schoolwork is done before you do, but look her up. She's really fascinating. The next pharaoh was a man named Thutmose III. Thutmose III was a great warrior king. Now, like I said, the kings of the New Kingdom were all warrior kings, but Thutmose III was the greatest warrior king. He invaded Palestine. He invaded Syria. He used the chariot to do that. And during his reign, the Egyptian empire went all the way up to the Euphrates River. So if you were to look at a map of modern day Egypt and you were to see that the Euphrates River is in modern day Iraq, you could get an idea of how big Thutmose's little empire was. Now, remember me saying Hatshepsut was a regent at first for her nephew because he was too young to rule. Not all of the rulers became rulers as adults. Some of them became rulers at very young ages. There was a king that is very interesting to a lot of people, and I'll talk a little bit more about him, but he was only 9 years old when he began to rule, and that was Pharaoh Tutankhamun. He was only 9 years old when he began to rule. Tutankhamun died when he was about 19 years old. He didn't accomplish a lot in his life. In fact, scientists have done many x-rays and MRIs and imaging of his mummy, and they figured out that he was a very sickly young man. He was not a young man who was well and healthy. So we know that he died at a very young age. He died at age 19. And he was buried in the Valley of the Kings. But the reason King Tut is the most famous of the pharaohs is because his tomb didn't get robbed. Somehow his tomb was forgotten. And so in 1922, so just about 100 years ago, there was a British archaeologist named Howard Carter, and he discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun. Now, because King Tutankhamun's tomb had not been found prior to this, so it had been there for, goodness, 3,000 years, right? Or so. Yeah, almost 3,000 years. Because of that, everything that was in the tomb was there. Everything that King Tut's advisors and his family had put in his tomb to go with him to the afterlife was all there. It contained thousands of objects and just a mind-boggling amount of wealth. It took Howard Carter over 8 years to catalog everything that was in this tomb. Statues, furniture, toys, food, the mummy, the sarcophagus, all of this stuff. In fact, there was so much stuff in there that the thing that King Tut, as he is affectionately called in Egyptologist circles, is the thing that he was most famous for was his tomb. He was most famous for his tomb. He really wasn't that great or important of a pharaoh when he was alive. But because his tomb was intact, we have learned so much about the way ancient Egyptians lived and the way they died. I do want you to look at page 73 in your book, and I want you to notice there is a photograph of Howard Carter with with Tutankhamun's sarcophagus, and then you'll see a photograph of King Tutankhamun's funerary mask. So this is a mask that's meant to look like what King Tut might have looked like in real life, but you can see that it's made out of gold and carnelian and lapis lazuli, and I believe that's turquoise in there. It's an amazing thing to see. At one point, I was at a museum that had some of these things on exhibit, and I got to see it, and it's just astonishingly beautiful, very detailed. You can't really see it in the picture in your book, but even in the beard, like it's braided, and so it looks like there are these stripes of gold and different precious stones in there, and it's quite amazing. There was another very interesting king, and before we talk about Ramses II, I do want to say that I really enjoy the cartoon movie, The Prince of Egypt. I thought it was really well done. But one of the things that they got wrong was that Ramses was not the pharaoh of the Exodus. That was not Ramses. I can't remember the name. The name of the pharaoh of the Exodus is actually a really difficult name, and that's probably why they just kind of picked Ramses out of the air. Ramses II. Ramses II was one of the last pharaohs who kept the empire strong. And so, in fact, on our SAM, it says Ramses was one of the last strong pharaohs. Ramses II, again, a very, very, very interesting person. He defeated the Hittites. Remember, we've talked about them. He signed a peace treaty with a new Hittite king. So he defeated them, drove them out of Egypt, and then signed a peace treaty. He built some amazing temples. One of the most famous is the temple at Karnak. I actually have a book here in my library, in my classroom, that has some really just gorgeous photographs of what the temple at Karnak looks like now. The statues of Ramses at the Abu Simbel temple are, I looked this up, 22 meters tall. So these are giant, ginormous statues. We have so many statues of Ramses II. Also, he liked to scratch other pharaohs' names out and write his own name on things. So for a long time, people thought, oh, look at all this stuff Ramses built. And then it turns out that Ramses did build a lot of stuff, but he also scratched other pharaohs' names out and put his name on stuff that other pharaohs built. So while he did build a lot, he didn't build as much as historians thought at first. He's also known as Ramses the Great. He had a reputation for being a wise pharaoh and a good pharaoh, which is why we know he wasn't the pharaoh of the Exodus. When he died, he had a beautiful tomb. Grave robbers broke into his tomb like they did so many other pharaohs, but they didn't destroy his mummy. And so if you were to go to the Egyptian city of Cairo and visit the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, you would be able to see the mummy of Ramses II, or Ramses the Great. After Ramses II died, Egypt just sort of grew weaker and weaker. The pharaohs weren't able to protect Egypt from invaders, and 200 years after Ramses died, there were people from the west that invaded Egypt, and from that period on, Egypt was mostly ruled by people who were not Egyptian. In fact, it was ruled by people who were not Egyptian from that time on through the 1900s. And it was ruled by other people, by the British, by other people, until the modern state of Egypt was formed in the mid 20th century, which is something very interesting and also a little bit sad. I do want you to look at page 74 because I want you to see these statues of Ramses the Great, Ramses II, and how amazingly large they were, but also how very, very detailed they were. So we've finished talking about the New Kingdom. What we're going to talk about next is the culture of Egypt. And so we're going to actually work on the crossword puzzle on page 44 as our note-taking. And so I look forward to talking about that with you, and we'll see you later.